The divorce papers sat on the dashboard of Marcus Webb's Forest Service truck, ink still fresh from the clerk's stamp. Final. Irrevocable. 20 years of marriage reduced to 14 pages of legal language that divided assets, assigned custody, and severed vows made when both of them still believed in permanence. He pulled into the ranger station parking lot just as dawn broke over the Cascade Mountains, painting the peaks in shades of rust and gold that should have been beautiful but only reminded him of endings. His phone buzzed. Another text from Jennifer's lawyer. Client requests confirmation that Mr. Webb has vacated marital residence. Failure to comply will result in contempt proceedings. Marcus deleted it without responding. He'd moved out 3 weeks ago, taken everything that mattered, which turned out to be almost nothing. Clothes, camping gear, his grandfather's compass, and a photograph of his son taken before the accident. Before everything fell apart, the station was empty. Most rangers didn't arrive until 7, but Marcus had been coming early for months now. Sleep had become impossible in the silence of his rental apartment, where every sound echoed his failure. Failed husband, failed father, failed protector of the son who needed him most. He made coffee in the break room, the routine mechanical and comforting. The bulletin board held the usual notices: trail closures, bear sightings, a reminder about the upcoming budget review. But one new posting caught his eye, printed on official county letterhead. Estate settlement notice. Property of Gerald Hartman, deceased. Heirs required to contact Morrison and Associates law firm within 30 days or property reverts to the state. Marcus stared at the name. Gerald Hartman. He knew that name. Should know it. The memory surfacing slowly through the fog of exhaustion and grief. His mother's maiden name. Hartman. She'd mentioned an uncle once, maybe twice before she died. A recluse who'd lived somewhere in the mountains, estranged from the family over some long-forgotten dispute. He pulled out his phone, called the number on the notice. A secretary answered on the third ring, voice professionally pleasant. Morrison and Associates. This is Marcus Webb. I'm calling about the Gerald Hartman estate notice. A pause, the sound of typing. Are you claiming to be an heir, Mr. Webb? I think so. Gerald was my mother's uncle. She passed away 6 years ago, but if there are no other relatives. One moment, the hold music was classical, something by Brahms that his mother had loved. When the secretary returned, her tone had shifted from routine to interested. Mr. Morrison would like to speak with you directly. Can you hold? The lawyer who came on the line sounded elderly, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent managing other people's complicated legacies. Mr. Webb, I've been the executor of Gerald Hartman's estate for 3 months now. Try to locate any living relatives. Your mother, Catherine, was his niece. Yes. Then you're his sole heir. Gerald was very specific in his will. The property goes to Catherine's child, assuming one existed. He had no other family. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. What property? 160 acres in the northern Cascades, including a homestead dating back to 1918 and several outbuildings. The land is remote, accessible only by logging roads. Gerald lived there alone for 60 years. No electricity, no running water, completely self-sufficient until he died last winter. I never even knew he existed. That was intentional. Gerald severed contact with your family in 1965, some dispute with your grandmother over inheritance rights. He spent the rest of his life essentially hiding from the world. Morrison paused. I need to be honest with you, Mr. Webb. The property has been abandoned for 8 months. It's in rough condition. 3 previous potential buyers backed out after initial inspections. There are complications. The word hung in the air like a warning. Marcus thought about his empty apartment, about the custody arrangement that gave Jennifer primary care of their surviving son, while he got supervised weekends and child support payments that consumed half his salary. Thought about the ranger station where he'd worked for 15 years, doing work that mattered but never quite filled the void. What kind of complications? The homestead is structurally unsound in places. The main barn has been sealed for decades. No one knows why. And there have been reports from hikers of unusual occurrences on the property. Lights, sounds, the kind of things that make people nervous. I'm a park ranger, Mr. Morrison. I've spent 20 years in these mountains. I'm not afraid of old buildings or superstitious stories. Good. Because the will includes conditions. You must reside on the property for 6 months and personally assess its historical and environmental significance. Gerald was an amateur naturalist, kept extensive records. He wanted someone who would understand the land's value beyond monetary considerations. Marcus thought about what 6 months alone in the mountains might offer. Distance from Jennifer's new life with her new boyfriend. Space to grieve without well-meaning colleagues asking how he was doing. Time to figure out what came next. When can I see it? I'll email you directions. The property is about 40 miles north of your current station. Fair warning, the last mile is barely passable even with four-wheel drive. Bring supplies. There's nothing up there except what Gerald left behind. The drive took 2 hours on paved roads, then another hour crawling up a logging track that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. Marcus's truck groaned over ruts and fallen branches, climbed through elevation zones where pine gave way to fir, where the air grew thin and cold even in late September. The GPS lost signal at mile marker 38. He continued by dead reckoning, following Morrison's printed directions and the fading tire tracks that suggested someone had come this way recently. Probably the lawyer himself, doing whatever legal inspection was required. The forest opened suddenly into a clearing that took his breath away. A natural meadow stretched across 20 acres, surrounded by old-growth timber that had somehow escaped the logging operations that had cleared most of the range. And in the center, like something from a frontier photograph, stood the homestead. The main house was 2 stories, constructed from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to silver gray. The roof sagged in the middle, and several windows gaped empty, but the basic structure looked solid. To the left, a smaller cabin, probably a workshop or guest quarters. To the right, the barn. Marcus stopped the truck, engine idling, and stared at the barn. It was massive, built in the old style with a gambrel roof and massive timber framing visible through gaps in the siding. But what caught his attention was the door, the main entrance sealed with boards nailed in an X pattern, reinforced with metal straps, and secured with a padlock that looked newer than anything else on the property. He killed the engine. Silence rushed in, broken only by wind through the pines and the distant call of a raven. Marcus climbed out, boots crunching on grass that had grown knee-high without anyone to mow it. The air smelled of pine resin and approaching autumn, clean and sharp in a way that made his lungs ache. The main house drew him first. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, unlocked. Inside, the space was larger than he'd expected. A central room with a stone fireplace dominated the ground floor, flanked by a kitchen on one side and what looked like a study on the other. Furniture sat covered in dust sheets, shapes suggesting chairs and tables that had waited years for occupants who never returned. Marcus moved through the rooms, his ranger training automatically cataloging structural concerns. Floor joists solid, wall logs tight, chimney intact. The second floor held 3 bedrooms, each sparsely furnished, each window offering views of the mountains that were genuinely spectacular. But it was the study that held him longest. One wall was floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, volumes on forestry, biology, geology, astronomy. A desk sat beneath the window, its surface covered in journals. Marcus opened one at random, found pages filled with meticulous handwriting documenting observations of local wildlife, weather patterns, geological formations. June 15th, 1987. Discovered what appears to be an old mine entrance on the eastern boundary. Sealed with rubble, likely from the 1920s silver boom that collapsed when the veins proved shallow. Must investigate further. The barn continues to concern me. Sounds in the night that I cannot explain with natural phenomena. Have reinforced the seal. Will not open it again. Marcus read the entry twice. The barn continues to concern me. Will not open it again. He flipped through other journals, found multiple references spanning decades. Gerald had been obsessed with the barn, had documented attempts to understand what was inside, had finally given up and simply ensured it stayed sealed. Outside, Marcus approached the barn slowly, afternoon sun casting long shadows across the clearing. Up close, the structure was even more impressive. Hand-forged nails, mortise and tenon joints, the kind of craftsmanship that belonged to an era when buildings were meant to outlast their builders. The padlock was modern, stainless steel, professionally installed. Marcus tried it anyway, knowing it would hold. The boards covering the door were thick planks, nailed deep into the frame with enough force to suggest urgency or fear. He walked the perimeter, looking for other entrances. Found a smaller door on the south side, also sealed. Windows set high near the roofline, too small and too high to access without a ladder. Whatever was inside, Gerald had been thorough about keeping it contained. Marcus returned to his truck, pulled out his satellite phone, the one piece of equipment that worked this far from civilization. He called Morrison. The barn is sealed. Heavy reinforcement. What? The lawyer side. Gerald's journals mention it, but he never explained. He sealed it in 1962, before I became his attorney. Every time I asked, he'd say the barn contained family history that needed to remain undisturbed. He made me promise not to open it, even after his death. But it's mine now. The will doesn't restrict access. No, the will simply states you must assess the property's significance. What you choose to investigate is up to you. After hanging up, Marcus stood in the clearing as dusk approached, watching the barn shadow stretch across the meadow like a pointing finger. Every instinct said to leave it alone, respect whatever decision Gerald had made. But curiosity warred with caution, and underneath both was the need to understand what he'd inherited. That night, Marcus slept in the main house, in a bedroom that smelled of dust and memories. He'd brought camping supplies, a sleeping bag, and freeze-dried food that was better than anything Jennifer had cooked in the last 5 years of their marriage. The house settled around him, wood contracting as temperature dropped, normal sounds that shouldn't have felt ominous but did. At 2 a.m, he woke to sound, not from the house, from outside, a low groaning, like metal under stress or timber shifting. Marcus grabbed his flashlight, moved to the window. In the moonlight, the barn stood silent, dark, exactly as he'd left it. But as he watched, he heard it again, definitely coming from the barn. A sound like something large moving inside, accompanied by a smell he couldn't quite identify. Old earth, maybe. Mineral, damp, wrong. He spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, watching the barn, seeing nothing but unable to shake the feeling that something inside was aware of his presence. That it had been waiting, sealed away for decades, and now it knew someone had finally come to claim the property. Dawn brought clarity and embarrassment. Marcus checked the barn in full daylight, found nothing amiss. The seal was intact. The sounds had probably been wind, or an animal in the rafters, or his own exhausted imagination creating threats where none existed. He spent the day exploring the property, mapping the boundaries using his GPS and Gerald's hand-drawn survey maps that were surprisingly accurate. The land was extraordinary, untouched wilderness that held ecological value beyond any monetary assessment. Old-growth forest, a creek running through the eastern section, wildlife corridors that connected to the national forest beyond. But his eyes kept returning to the barn. In his pocket, he carried a crowbar from his truck. Professional tools for opening secured structures. He told himself he was just being thorough, that assessing the property meant understanding all its components. By afternoon, he'd made his decision. The barn was his property now. Whatever Gerald's reasons for sealing it, those reasons had died with him. Marcus had a right to know what he'd inherited. The crowbar made short work of the first board. The wood was old, brittle despite its thickness. Each plank came away with a shriek of nails pulled from wood, the sound echoing across the empty meadow like a warning he chose to ignore. 10 minutes of work, and the door stood partially exposed. Marcus could see the original entrance, a massive sliding door on iron tracks. The lock was modern, but the door itself was secured by something internal, a bar or bolt mechanism that resisted his attempts to force it. He considered walking away, leaving the barn for another day, another week, another person. But momentum had him now, and beneath the rational objections was something else. A pull, almost gravitational, the certainty that whatever was inside was important. That Gerald had sealed it not to protect others from what it contained, but to protect what it contained from others. Marcus retrieved his truck, drove it close to the barn, used the winch to pull the door. The mechanism resisted, groaned, then gave way with a sound like bones breaking. The door slid open 3 feet, then stopped, blocked by something inside. The smell that emerged was overwhelming. Not rot or decay, but mineral, stone dust, and metal and water that had sat stagnant for decades. Marcus turned on his heavy-duty flashlight, aimed the beam into the darkness. The barn's interior was larger than the outside suggested, something impossible but undeniable. The space stretched back further than the building's dimensions allowed, disappearing into shadows as light couldn't penetrate. And the floor, instead of dirt or wood, was stone. Smooth, carved, deliberate. Marcus stepped inside, his boots echoing on the rock surface. The barn's roof disappeared above, replaced by darkness so complete it felt solid. He swept his light across the space, saw walls lined with what looked like alcoves or niches, each one holding shapes he couldn't quite identify. Then his beam landed on the far wall, and his breath stopped. A door, not barn wood but stone, carved directly into what should have been the back wall, but was clearly something else. Something older. The door was maybe 6 feet tall, 3 feet wide, covered in symbols he didn't recognize. Not petroglyphs in the Native American style he knew from the region. Something different, geometric, precise, almost mathematical. And below the symbols, words. English, carved deep and clear. What lies beyond serve its purpose. What was saved cannot be unsaved. Honor their sacrifice by leaving them in peace. Marcus stood in the impossible space, reading the inscription again and again, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The barn wasn't a barn. It was a facade built around something much older, something Gerald had discovered and then spent 60 years protecting. His phone buzzed. Text from Jennifer's lawyer. Final custody arrangement requires proof of stable housing. Please provide documentation within 30 days. Marcus looked at the message, then at the stone door, then back at the impossible geometry of the space around him. He'd inherited more than land. He'd inherited a mystery that had consumed Gerald's life. And standing here in the darkness with his flashlight beam trembling across ancient stone, Marcus understood that it was about to consume his. He took photographs. The stone floor, the carved door, the inscription. Evidence that he wasn't hallucinating, that the barn contained something significant enough to warrant further investigation. His mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. An old mine? But the stonework was too refined, too intentional. A natural cave? But caves didn't have carved doors with warnings in English. A bunker? From what era? And for what purpose? Marcus approached the door carefully, running his hand along the symbols. They were warm, which made no sense. The barn was cold, had been sealed for decades, but the stone radiated gentle heat like something alive. He tried the door. No handle, no obvious mechanism. Just solid rock that didn't budge when he pushed. He examined the edges, looking for hinges or pivot points, found nothing. The door might not be a door at all, just a carved facade meant to look like an entrance. But the inscription suggested otherwise. What lies beyond implied something beyond, some space or chamber that the door protected. And honor their sacrifice suggested people, plural, who had done something worth memorializing. Marcus spent an hour documenting everything. Measurements, photographs, sketches. His ranger training had taught him proper field documentation, and whatever this was, it deserved thorough records. When he finally emerged from the barn, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in the same colors as that morning's divorce papers. He called Morrison again, described what he'd found. The lawyer was silent for a long moment. Gerald never mentioned anything like this. His journals talked about the barn, but always cryptically. I assumed it was just an old structure he didn't want damaged. This is more than an old structure. The stonework alone suggests significant archaeological value, and the inscription implies historical significance we don't understand yet. What are you going to do? Marcus looked at the barn, at the door he'd forced open, at the mystery he'd inherited along with the land. I'm going to figure out what Gerald was protecting, and why he spent 60 years keeping it sealed. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He sat at Gerald's desk, reading through journals, looking for any mention of how his uncle had discovered the stone chamber beneath the barn. The entries were meticulous but frustrating, often cryptic, as if Gerald had been writing for himself rather than any future reader. August 3rd, 1962. Found it today. The old Bergstrom place, abandoned since the 1920s, held more than a barn. Took me 3 days to clear the debris. What I discovered changes everything. Must decide what to do. Some doors are sealed for reasons that transcend property rights or curiosity. September 1st, 1962. I've spent the past month researching the Bergstrom family. Norwegian immigrants arrived 1895, purchased this land from the territorial government, built the homestead and barn, then disappeared in 1924, all 6 family members without a trace. Local records suggest they simply abandoned the property, but census data confirms no Bergstroms ever appeared elsewhere. They vanished. September 15th, 1962. I understand now. The door must remain sealed. What they saved came at a cost I cannot fully comprehend. My responsibility is to ensure their sacrifice wasn't wasted. We'll build a new facade, make the barn appear ordinary. Future generations must not stumble into this without proper preparation. Marcus set down the journal, his mind racing. The Bergstrom family had disappeared in 1924. Gerald had discovered their secret in 1962 and spent the rest of his life protecting it. Now, 63 years later, Marcus had opened what his uncle had sealed. He thought about the inscription. What was saved cannot be unsaved. Saved from what? And why did honoring their sacrifice require leaving it undisturbed? His satellite phone rang, making him jump. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but Ranger instincts said you always answer calls in the backcountry. Someone might need help. Mr. Webb? The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. My name is Dr. Sarah Chun. I'm a historian specializing in Pacific Northwest settlement patterns. Your lawyer, Mr. Morrison, contacted me about a potential historical discovery on your property. I understand you found something unusual in a barn structure. Marcus's guard went up immediately. How did you get this number? Mr. Morrison provided it. I apologize for the intrusion, but what he described is potentially significant. A stone chamber with carved inscriptions beneath a homestead barn could be evidence of earlier occupation than we previously thought possible in this region. I'd like to request permission to conduct a preliminary site assessment. I just discovered this yesterday. How did Morrison contact you so quickly? A pause. He didn't. I've been trying to locate the Hartman property for 3 years. Gerald Hartman refused all contact, but I knew from county records that he owned the former Bergstrom homestead. When I saw the estate settlement notice, I contacted Mr. Morrison immediately. He called me back today after you described your findings. Marcus walked to the window, looked out at the barn. What do you know about the Bergstroms? More than anyone alive? Probably. I wrote my dissertation on Norwegian immigrant communities in the Cascades, 1890 to 1930. The Bergstroms are an anomaly in the historical record. They appear suddenly, purchase land, build extensively, then vanish without a trace. No death certificates, no property sales, no forwarding addresses. It's as if they simply ceased to exist. Gerald's journals say the family disappeared in 1924. All 6 members. That matches my research. But here's what's interesting. In 1923, 1 year before they vanished, Lars Bergstrom, the patriarch, made a series of large cash deposits to the Territorial Land Office. Over $30,000, which in 1923 was an enormous sum. He purchased additional land parcels surrounding his homestead, creating a buffer zone. Then silence. Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. He was protecting something, creating distance between whatever was on his property and the nearest neighbors. That's my theory. And if what you found is what I think it might be, we're looking at something that could rewrite our understanding of this region's history. What do you think it is? Dr. Chin hesitated. I need to see it before I speculate. But Mr. Webb, if you're willing to grant access, I can be there tomorrow. I have ground-penetrating radar, archaeological survey equipment, proper documentation protocols. Whatever is behind that door, it deserves to be investigated professionally. Marcus thought about Jennifer's lawyer demanding proof of stable housing, about the custody arrangement that gave him only supervised weekends with his son, about 6 months in the mountains with nothing but Gerald's journals and a mystery that had consumed his uncle's entire life. Tomorrow is too soon. Give me a week to do my own investigation. Then we'll talk about bringing in experts. After hanging up, Marcus returned to the journals, reading late into the night. Gerald had been methodical, documenting his research into the Bergstroms with the same precision he'd applied to cataloging local wildlife. October 1962. Found Bergstrom family photographs at the County Historical Society. 6 people. Lars, the father, strong, weathered, eyes that seemed to carry ancient knowledge. Ingrid, his wife, stern, protective. For children ranging from 8 to 16. All healthy, all missing. October 1962. Interviewed oldest resident in the valley, a man named Thomas who was 20 in 1924. He remembers the Bergstroms as strange but good neighbors. Said Lars spent months constructing the barn in 1918, brought in specialized stone masons from Seattle, worked them in complete secrecy. When the barn was finished, Lars dismissed the workers and never allowed anyone inside again. November 1962. I opened the door. God forgive me, I opened it. What I found I cannot unseal. The Bergstroms saved something precious, something that cost them everything. I understand now why they disappeared, why they chose that sacrifice. I will protect their legacy. The door stays closed. The final entry stopped Marcus cold. Gerald had opened the door, had seen what was beyond, and whatever he'd found had convinced him to seal it for the rest of his life. Marcus stood, paced the small study, mind churning. Gerald had been a naturalist, a scientist, a rational man who'd chosen isolation over human contact. He wasn't prone to superstition or exaggeration. If he said what was beyond the door needed protection, there was a reason. But Marcus was different. He'd spent 20 years as a ranger, seen mountains collapse and rivers change course, witnessed nature's power and indifference. Whatever the Bergstroms had sealed away, it was part of the land now, part of his inheritance, and he needed to understand it. Dawn found him back at the barn, standing before the stone door with a crowbar and a decision. Gerald had spent 60 years protecting this secret. But Gerald was dead, and Marcus was alive, and the mystery pulled at him with gravitational force he couldn't resist. He examined the door more carefully in daylight that filtered through gaps in the barn's roof. The symbols weren't random, he realized. They formed patterns, repeating sequences that suggested language or mathematics. And around the door's perimeter, almost invisible unless you knew to look, a thin gap showed that the door wasn't solid stone, but some kind of mechanism designed to open. Marcus wedged the crowbar into the gap, applied pressure. The door didn't budge. He tried different angles, different points of leverage, achieving nothing except scraped knuckles and growing frustration. The door was sealed from the inside, or locked by a mechanism he couldn't see. He was about to give up when he noticed something. One symbol, repeated 4 times at cardinal points around the door's frame. A spiral inside a circle, with lines radiating outward like sun rays. He'd seen that symbol before, in Gerald's journals, sketched in the margins of entries about the Bergstroms. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolled through the photographs he'd taken of the journals. Found the matching symbol on a page dated November 1962. Below it, Gerald had written, "The key is intention, not mechanism. They built this for those who would understand sacrifice." Intention. Marcus stared at the door, at the inscription warning him to honor their sacrifice by leaving it sealed. What if the door wasn't mechanically locked? What if it required something else? He placed his hand flat against the stone, felt the warmth he'd noticed before. "I want to understand," he said aloud, feeling foolish but compelled to try. "I want to honor what they did. I need to know." The door shuddered. Marcus jumped back, heart hammering. The stone's surface rippled like water, the symbols glowing faintly with light that came from within the rock itself. Then, with a sound like a long-held breath released, the door swung inward. Beyond it, darkness waited, but not empty darkness. Marcus could feel air moving, could smell earth and water and something else. Something alive. He turned on his flashlight, aimed it through the doorway, and saw stairs. Stone steps descending into the earth, carved with the same precision as the door. The walls on either side were covered in more symbols, more inscriptions, a language he couldn't read, but that felt almost familiar. Marcus stood on the threshold, every instinct screaming to walk away. Gerald had sealed this for a reason. The Bergstroms had disappeared protecting it. Opening this door might unleash something better left contained. But he'd already come this far, already broken the seal his uncle had maintained for 6 decades. Turning back now wouldn't undo what he'd started. It would only leave the mystery incomplete, the door open, the secret exposed, but not understood. He descended the first step, then the second. The door remained open behind him, a rectangle of dim barn light that grew smaller as he went deeper. The stairs curved, following the natural contour of something, a cave system, maybe, or a deliberately excavated chamber. After 30 steps, the stairs ended. Marcus emerged into a space so vast his flashlight couldn't find its boundaries. The beam disappeared into darkness that swallowed light like a living thing. He could hear water, a distant sound like an underground river, could feel air moving, suggesting the space connected to the surface somewhere, some natural ventilation system keeping the air fresh. He swept his light across the ground immediately around him. More carved stone, but these weren't blank surfaces. They were covered in writing. Not the symbols from the door, but English. Hundreds of words, thousands, carved directly into the rock floor. Marcus knelt, read the nearest inscription. June 15th, 1918. Lars Bergstrom. We found them today. 73 souls, frozen in the ice, preserved by the mountain's mercy. They sought refuge here in 1856, fleeing persecution, seeking freedom. The avalanche came before they could descend. They've been waiting 62 years for someone to find them, to bear witness, to remember. Marcus's hands shook, making the light waver. He read on. We cannot move them. The ice is too deep, the passage too narrow. But we can protect them. Build a memorial no one will disturb. Give them the dignity they were denied in life. Our family makes this our purpose. This barn, this land, becomes their tomb and our trust. The inscription continued, detailing the discovery. How Lars and his eldest son had been exploring caves on the property when they'd found the ice chamber. How they'd realized the bodies were those of immigrants, possibly refugees, who'd been caught by winter in the mountains decades before anyone kept records of such tragedies. More inscriptions covered the floor, each dated, each signed by a Bergstrom. Ingrid's entry detailed how they decided to keep the discovery secret, fearing that authorities would disturb the bodies, that the dead would become curiosities rather than being honored. The children's entries, even the youngest, spoke of the responsibility they felt to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And then, the final inscription, March 20th, 1924. All 6 family names. We have kept faith for 6 years. But the world intrudes. The government wants this land for logging. Developers have made offers we cannot refuse without raising suspicion. They will find the chamber, will excavate, will disturb what we swore to protect. We cannot allow this. Today we make our choice. We join those we've guarded. The avalanche path is old, but ice remembers. We descend together, all 6, to become guardians in death as we were in life. May whoever finds this understand. Some graves are sacred. Some debts transcend life. We pay ours willingly. Marcus sat hard on the stone floor, the flashlight falling from numb fingers and rolling away. The Bergstroms hadn't disappeared. They descended into the ice deliberately, had chosen to die protecting the refugees they discovered, had sealed themselves in the mountain alongside the souls they'd sworn to guard. His light stopped rolling against something. A wall, he thought at first, then realized it was ice. Clear, thick, ancient ice that filled a passage leading deeper into the mountain. And within that ice, visible through the crystalline surface, shapes. Human shapes. Frozen in positions that suggested they'd been walking, fleeing, seeking shelter from a storm that had killed them over a century and a half ago. Marcus could see faces preserved perfectly by the ice. Men, women, children. 73 souls, the inscription had said. 73 people whose names and stories had been lost to time. And among them, closer to the surface, newer figures. The Bergstrom family. Lars standing protectively over his wife and children, ice making their final embrace eternal. Marcus understood now why Gerald had sealed the barn, why the door carried its warning. This wasn't a treasure in any conventional sense. It was a mass grave, turned memorial, turned sacred trust. Opening it to the world would mean disturbing not just the refugees who died seeking freedom, but the family who'd chosen death to protect their memory. He sat in the darkness for a long time, flashlight illuminating the ice, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd inherited. Gerald had known about this, had opened the door once, had seen what Marcus was seeing now, and had made the same choice the Bergstroms made. To protect, to keep sealed, to honor the sacrifice by ensuring it wasn't wasted. But Marcus had broken that seal. The door was open. Dr. Chin knew something significant was here. Eventually, word would spread. Archaeologists, historians, government officials. They'd come, they'd excavate, they'd disturb what 10 people had died protecting. Unless he made a different choice. Marcus gathered his flashlight, stood, and walked back toward the stairs. His mind was already working through possibilities, through decisions that would determine whether he honored what he'd inherited or destroyed it through exposure. The 6 months Gerald's were required suddenly made perfect sense. Not to assess the land's environmental value, but to give Marcus time to understand what truly mattered here. To make the same choice Gerald had made. To become the next guardian of secrets that deserved protection. He climbed the stairs slowly, emerged into the barn, and stood before the stone door. It waited, open, patient. Marcus thought about Jennifer's lawyer demanding proof of stable housing. About his son, who needed a father. About the life he'd lost and the purpose he might gain. Then he thought about 73 refugees who'd died seeking freedom. About a family who'd chosen death over betraying a trust. About Gerald, who'd given up human contact to keep a promise to the dead. Marcus pulled out his phone, called Morrison. I need to know exactly what the will requires. The precise language. The lawyer shuffled papers. Reside on the property for 6 months and personally assess its historical and environmental significance. Then submit a written report of your findings to my office. Upon completion, the property transfers to you free and clear. And if I choose not to transfer it, if I decide it should revert to the state, a long pause. That's within your rights. Gerald's will states that you must make the assessment. It doesn't dictate your conclusion. Why? What did you find? Marcus looked at the ice-filled passage, at the faces frozen in time, at the legacy of sacrifice that stretched across a century. Something that needs to stay found but protected. I'll submit my report in 6 months. Until then, I need you to delay Dr. Chun. Tell her the property is under estate settlement restrictions. Tell her anything, but keep everyone away. After hanging up, Marcus spent the rest of the day documenting everything. Photographs, measurements, careful records of the inscriptions. Evidence that the Bergstrom sacrifice had happened, that it mattered, that it deserved remembrance, even if that remembrance remained private. As the sun set, he stood before the stone door one final time, placed his hand against its surface, felt the warmth, and spoke to the empty air. I understand now. Gerald understood. The Bergstroms understood. Some graves are sacred. Some debts transcend life. I'll pay mine the same way you paid yours. The door swung closed with that same sound like a long-held breath. The symbols stopped glowing. The stone became just stone again, warm and silent and keeping its secrets. Marcus walked out of the barn into the twilight and began making plans for the next 6 months. Plans that didn't include opening the door again. Plans that involved learning everything Gerald had known, understanding every detail of the trust he'd inherited. He would live here in isolation, protecting what needed protection, would submit his report recommending the property remain undeveloped in perpetuity, would ensure the Bergstrom sacrifice and Gerald's lifetime of guardianship, and the 73 souls frozen in the mountain would remain undisturbed. His phone buzzed. Text from Jennifer. Your son asked about you today. Said he misses hiking with you. When can we arrange a visit? Marcus looked at the message, then at the barn, then at the mountains turning purple with dusk. He had 6 months to figure out how to balance being a father with being a guardian. 6 months to understand if the two were compatible. But tonight, the choice was clear. Some doors, once opened, changed everything. This one had changed him, had shown him that inheritance meant more than property. It meant responsibility to protect what others had died protecting. Marcus walked into the house, into Gerald's study, and opened a fresh journal. On the first page, he wrote, September 2024. Marcus Webb. I opened the door Gerald sealed. I saw what the Bergstroms died protecting. I understand now why some secrets must remain secret, why some sacrifices demand equal sacrifice in return. For the next 6 months, I become the guardian. After that, I'll decide if this is my life's work or just a debt to be paid. Either way, the door stays closed. The dead stay honored. The trust continues. He set down his pen, looked out the window at the barn barely visible in gathering darkness, and felt something he hadn't experienced in the years since his son's accident and his marriage's collapse. Purpose. Clear, absolute, demanding. Not comfortable, not easy, but real in a way nothing else had been for too long. Marcus Webb had inherited more than land. He'd inherited a responsibility that transcended property rights or personal desire. And sitting in his dead uncle's study, in a house that would become his prison and sanctuary for the next half year, he accepted that burden with the same determination the Bergstroms had shown. Some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed. But this one could. This one would. And Marcus would make sure it stayed closed for as long as necessary, even if it took the rest of his life. The first week passed in isolation that Marcus initially welcomed, then endured, then began to question. He established routines that gave structure to days that otherwise blurred together. Wake at dawn, check the barn seal, spend mornings reading Gerald's journals, afternoons repairing the homestead, evenings documenting everything he learned. The house revealed itself slowly. Behind dust sheets, he found furniture Gerald had maintained despite living alone for decades. A dining table that could seat 8. Chairs carved with Norwegian designs that must have belonged to the Bergstroms. In the kitchen, cookware hung from hooks, waiting for meals that would never be prepared for the family that had died protecting strangers. Marcus cooked simple meals on the wood stove, learning to manage fire and temperature through trial and error. His first attempts were disasters, burned on the outside and raw in the middle. But by day 5, he could produce edible food, and by day 7, he was actually enjoying the process. There was meditation in the work, in the focused attention required to coax heat from wood and turn basic ingredients into sustenance. His son called on day 8. The satellite phone's ring shattered the evening silence, making Marcus jump despite expecting the call. Jennifer had agreed to weekly check-ins, supervised by her lawyer, part of the custody arrangement's requirement that Marcus maintain contact. Dad! Ethan's voice sounded small, uncertain, the way it had been since the accident 2 years ago. Since the hiking trip where Marcus had looked away for just a moment, where his 12-year-old son had stepped too close to a cliff edge, where the fall had shattered bones and something less tangible but more permanent. Hey, buddy, how was your week? Okay, school started. I'm taking biology. We're studying forest ecosystems. A pause. Mom said you're living in the mountains now. By yourself. Marcus looked around the study, at Gerald's shelves of natural history texts, at windows showing forests that stretched for miles. I inherited property from my great-uncle. I'm staying here for a while, fixing it up. Is it lonely? The question hit harder than it should have. Sometimes, but there's a lot of work to do. Keeps me busy. I miss hiking with you. Ethan's voice dropped. I know I said I didn't want it anymore, after what happened. But I was thinking maybe we could try again. If you want. Marcus's throat tightened. They hadn't hiked together since the accident, since Ethan had spent 3 months in physical therapy relearning to walk without a limp. Jennifer blamed Marcus for being careless. Ethan blamed himself for not being more careful. Marcus blamed both of them and himself and the random chance that had aligned to create one moment of inattention with permanent consequences. I'd like that. When I get back, we'll start small. Easy trails. When are you coming back? 5 more months. The property requires 6 months of residence before I can make decisions about what to do with it. That's a long time. I know, but I call you every week. And maybe you can visit, if your mom agrees. After Ethan hung up, Marcus sat in the silence that felt heavier than before. Isolation had been exactly what he'd wanted. Escape from Jennifer's new boyfriend and well-meaning colleagues, and a constant reminder of his failures. But hearing his son's voice made the distance feel less like refuge and more like abandonment. He returned to Gerald's journals, seeking distraction in someone else's life. Found an entry from 1975 that stopped him cold. My brother's daughter, Catherine, wrote today. She's pregnant, due in the spring. She wants to reconcile, says family matters more than old disputes. I want to believe her, want to meet my niece or nephew. But doing so means leaving this place unguarded, even temporarily. The barn requires constant vigilance. I've seen hikers get too close, seen surveyors marking boundaries, seen the world creeping in year by year. If I leave, even for a week, I risk someone discovering what must remain hidden. So I wrote back declining. Said I was too old for travel, that she should focus on her new family. The lie tastes like ash, but the truth would taste worse. Some sacrifices are made in small moments, one refused invitation at a time. Marcus set down the journal. Gerald had given up family to protect the secret, had chosen isolation over connection, duty over love. Catherine was Marcus's grandmother, which meant Gerald had refused to meet his own great-nephew out of obligation to dead strangers and a family that had sacrificed themselves before he was born. The weight of that decision pressed against Marcus's chest. Was he supposed to make the same choice? Give up his relationship with Ethan to guard a grave no one knew existed? Spend the next 60 years alone in the mountains while his son grew up without a father? He walked outside, needing air, needing space from the implications. The night was clear, stars so bright they cast shadows. The barn stood silent against the darkness, its sealed door containing secrets that had consumed 3 generations of guardians. A sound made him turn. Movement at the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the house. Marcus grabbed his flashlight, swept the beam across the forest, caught reflection, eyes that glowed green in the light. Elk, probably, or deer. He watched until the animal moved off, then scanned the perimeter once more before going inside. But the unease stayed with him. Gerald's journals had mentioned feeling watched, hearing sounds that didn't match wildlife patterns. Marcus had dismissed it as the paranoia of isolation, but now he wondered. The property sat on a boundary between national forest and private land. Hikers occasionally wandered through. Hunters during season. People who might get curious about the barn, about why it was sealed so thoroughly. The next morning brought the sound of an engine. Marcus was repairing a section of the house's foundation when he heard it, a truck working its way up the logging road with grinding determination. He stood, wiped his hands, and waited. The vehicle that emerged from the tree line was a Forest Service truck, newer than his, with official markings that identified it as belonging to the district office. The driver who stepped out was Tom Fletcher, Marcus's supervisor, a man in his late 50s who'd spent his entire career in these mountains. Webb. Tom's greeting was neutral, professional. You're a hard man to find. That was sort of the point. I figured. Tom looked around, taking in the homestead with a ranger's eye that missed nothing. Morrison called the office, said you'd inherited property up here. Want to make sure you were still employed, or if we should start looking for your replacement. The implied threat was delivered casually, but Marcus heard it clearly. I'm on leave. Personal time I've accumulated over 15 years. 6 months of personal time is a lot. District manager is wondering if you're planning to come back, or if this is a resignation you haven't filed yet. Marcus thought about the barn, about the responsibility waiting inside it, about Gerald, who'd given up his career to stay here. I don't know yet. Tom's expression shifted, something that might have been disappointment or understanding. I get it. Divorce is hard. Losing custody of your kid is harder. But hiding in the mountains doesn't solve anything. Trust me, I tried it after my marriage ended. All it does is give you more time to think about what you've lost. This isn't hiding. It's honoring an obligation. To a dead uncle you never met. Tom shook his head. Look, I'm not here to judge. I'm here to tell you the clock is ticking. 3 more weeks of authorized leave. Then you're either back or you're unemployed. Your choice. After Tom left, Marcus stood in the yard feeling the weight multiply. 3 weeks until he had to choose between his career and the inheritance. Between the life he'd built over 15 years and a responsibility he'd discovered 8 days ago. He returned to the foundation repair, losing himself in physical work that had clear goals and visible progress. The stone needed repointing, mortar that had crumbled over decades of freeze-thaw cycles. Marcus mixed new mortar according to historical specifications he'd found in Gerald's notes, applied it with tools that had probably belonged to the Bergstroms. As he worked, he thought about the inscription on the stone door. Honor their sacrifice by leaving them in peace. The Bergstroms had given their lives. Gerald had given his future. What was Marcus willing to sacrifice? His career? His relationship with Ethan? The possibility of rebuilding his life after the divorce? The satellite phone rang again that evening. Unknown number. Marcus almost didn't answer, but ranger instincts overrode hesitation. Mr. Webb, this is Dr. Sarah Chun. We spoke last week about the Bergstrom property. Marcus's jaw tightened. I told Morrison to keep you away for 6 months. He did, but I'm calling about something else. Something that might change your mind about refusing access. She paused. I've been researching the 1856 disappearances. 73 people, mostly Norwegian immigrants, left Seattle in late October, heading for settlements in the interior. They never arrived. For 170 years, their fate has been unknown. But I found something in the archives yesterday. A letter from a survivor who turned back before they entered the mountains. There was a survivor? One. A woman named Greta Hansen. She was pregnant, couldn't make the journey, stayed behind in Seattle. Wrote to her family in Norway in 1857. Said the others had gone ahead despite warnings about early winter. She spent the rest of her life wondering what happened to them. Died in 1903, still not knowing if they'd survive somewhere. Started new lives, forgotten about the family they'd left behind. Marcus felt sick. Why are you telling me this? Because those 73 people have descendants. Families in Norway, in Minnesota, in Wisconsin who have spent generations wondering about ancestors who vanished. If you found them, if you know what happened, those families deserve closure. And if giving them closure means disturbing a grave that people died to protect. Dr. Chun was quiet for a long moment. Is that what you found? A grave? Marcus closed his eyes, knowing he'd said too much. I can't discuss it. Mr. Webb, I understand wanting to honor your uncle's wishes. But there's a difference between respecting the dead and keeping families in anguish. If you found those 73 people, their descendants have a right to know, to mourn properly, to bring them home, if possible. After hanging up, Marcus sat in the growing dark, Dr. Chin's words echoing. He hadn't considered descendants, hadn't thought about families still waiting for answers across the gulf of a century and a half. The Bergstroms had made their choice to protect the refugees' dignity. But had they considered that protection might mean perpetual grief for those left behind? He went to the barn, stood before the sealed door, placed his hand against the wood, feeling nothing this time. No warmth, no response. Just ordinary timber and the weight of decisions he didn't feel qualified to make. What do I do? He asked the empty air. Gerald, if you can hear me, what the hell do I do? Silence answered. The dead didn't speak, didn't offer guidance, left the living to stumble through choices that would have been difficult even with perfect information. Marcus returned to the house, pulled out his laptop, and began researching. If there were descendants, he needed to know who they were, what they wanted, whether bringing closure would honor the refugees or betray them. The genealogical databases yielded results faster than he'd expected. Greta Hansen's descendants numbered in the hundreds, spread across Norway, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Many had submitted DNA to ancestry databases, hoping to find connections to relatives who'd disappeared in 1856. Their profiles included notes about family legends, about the lost 73 who'd gone into the mountains and never returned. One profile belonged to a woman named Ingrid Larsen, 83 years old, living in Bergen, Norway. Her notes read, "My great-great-grandmother Greta Hansen lost her sister Carrie in the 1856 disappearance. Carrie was 16, traveling with her parents and siblings. Greta never forgave herself for not being there. Spent her whole life searching for information. I continue her search, hoping to finally learn what happened." Marcus stared at the words, feeling the weight of 170 years of grief compressed into a few sentences. Ingrid Larsen was in her 80s, had probably spent her entire life trying to solve a mystery that Marcus could answer with a single phone call. But answering it meant betraying the Bergstrom sacrifice, meant opening the door Gerald had sealed, meant potentially turning the ice chamber into an archaeological site where bodies were excavated, studied, cataloged, and removed from the mountain they died trying to cross. He thought about the inscription. What was saved cannot be unsaved. The Bergstroms had saved the refugees from being forgotten, had given them a memorial that preserved their dignity. Opening that memorial to the world might satisfy living descendants, but would violate the trust the dead had placed in their guardians. Marcus spent 3 days wrestling with the decision, reading Gerald's journals, examining the Bergstrom's inscriptions in his photographs, trying to understand what the right choice looked like when both options carried moral weight. On day 12, Jennifer called. Not their scheduled time, which meant something was wrong. "Marcus, I need to talk to you about Ethan." His stomach dropped. "What happened?" "Nothing happened. That's the problem." She sighed, the sound carrying exhaustion and frustration. "He's been withdrawn since you left. Grades dropping, doesn't talk to his friends. His therapist thinks he's depressed, that your absence is triggering memories of the accident, of feeling abandoned." "I'm not abandoning him. I call every week. You're living in the middle of nowhere for 6 months. How is that not abandonment?" Jennifer's voice rose, the anger she'd been containing finally breaking through. "I know you're dealing with a divorce, with losing custody, but Ethan needs his father. Not phone calls. His actual father, present and involved. The will requires 6 months. The will requires you to live there. It doesn't say you can't have visitors. Bring Ethan up there. Let him see what you're doing. Show him that you haven't just disappeared into the mountains because you can't deal with real life." Marcus thought about the barn, about the secret it contained, about explaining to his 14-year-old son why he was protecting graves of people who died before anyone in their family was born. "It's not set up for visitors. No electricity, no running water, barely habitable. He's been camping with you dozens of times. He can handle rustic conditions." Jennifer paused. "Marcus, I'm not asking. His therapist says he needs this. Either you arrange a visit, or I'm going back to court to argue that your absence constitutes abandonment and the custody arrangement should be modified." The threat was clear. Marcus could lose even the supervised weekends if Jennifer convinced a judge that he'd chosen property over parenting. "Fine. Give me 2 weeks to make the place safer. Then bring him up." After hanging up, Marcus looked around the homestead with new eyes. It was barely suitable for one person, let alone hosting a teenager. The house needed more repairs, the generator needed work, and he'd have to hide or explain everything about the barn and what it contained. He spent the next 13 days in frantic preparation. Fixed the generator so they'd have reliable power. Repaired the second-floor bathroom so it functioned properly. Stocked the kitchen with food Ethan actually ate. Created a cover story for the barn that sounded plausible. Old family structure, unsafe, sealed for liability reasons until he could afford proper restoration. Dr. Chun called twice more. Marcus didn't answer, let the calls go to voicemail, listened to her increasingly urgent messages about descendants who deserve closure, about moral obligations to the living, about how protecting the dead shouldn't mean abandoning the grieving. Tom Fletcher called once, reminder that Marcus's authorized leave expired in 1 week. Decision time approaching whether he acknowledged it or not. And through it all, the barn stood silent, keeping its secrets, waiting to see what choice its newest guardian would make. Jennifer's car arrived on day 26, a Saturday afternoon, when autumn had painted the mountains in shades of rust and gold. Ethan emerged from the passenger seat, taller than Marcus remembered, shoulders broader, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned not to trust his body after it had betrayed him once. "Hey, Dad." The greeting was cautious, uncertain. Marcus pulled his son into a hug that Ethan tolerated rather than returned. "Hey, buddy. Glad you're here." Jennifer stayed in the car, engine running. "I'll pick him up Sunday evening. You've got 24 hours. Make them count." She drove away without waiting for a response, gravel spraying. Ethan watched her go, then turned to survey the homestead. "This is where you've been living? For almost a month now. What do you think? It's remote." Ethan walked toward the house, limping slightly, the permanent reminder of the accident neither of them mentioned. No cell service. Satellite phone only. No internet, no TV, no modern conveniences except what I've managed to repair. Inside, Ethan moved through the rooms with the same careful observation Marcus remembered from their hiking trips. His son had always been good at noticing details, at asking questions about flora and fauna, about geology and weather patterns. The accident had stolen his confidence, but not his curiosity. "Whose stuff is this?" Ethan examined the books in Gerald's study. "My great-uncle's. He lived here for 60 years, alone, studying the local ecosystem." "Why alone?" Marcus hesitated. Because he was guarding a secret. Because he chose duty over family. Because sometimes people sacrifice everything for reasons they believe justify the cost. He valued solitude, preferred nature to people. Like you now. The observation stung because it was accurate. "I'm not hiding, if that's what you're asking. I'm honoring an obligation. To a dead guy you never met." Ethan turned from the bookshelf. "Mom thinks you're having a breakdown. That you couldn't handle the divorce, so you ran away. What do you think?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "I think something happened to you up here. Something that made you want to stay. I just don't know what." Marcus chose his words carefully. When you inherit something, you inherit the responsibility that comes with it. "Gerald left me more than property. He left me a trust that needs protecting." "What kind of trust?" "I can't tell you yet, but I will when I understand it better myself." They spent the afternoon exploring the property, staying away from the barn. Marcus showed Ethan the creek where Gerald had documented salmon runs for 50 years. The meadow where elk gathered during rutting season. The old-growth forest that had somehow survived the logging operations that had cleared the surrounding ranges. Ethan moved through it all with quiet appreciation, asking questions that showed he'd retained everything Marcus had taught him about wilderness navigation and ecology. The limp slowed him down, but he adapted, found his own pace, didn't complain about the terrain. As evening approached, they returned to the house. Marcus cooked dinner on the wood stove, venison stew he'd been preparing all day. They ate in the kitchen, the first meal Marcus had shared with another person in nearly a month. "This is good." Ethan sounded surprised. "I've had time to practice. Mom said you're thinking about not coming back. Staying here permanently." Marcus set down his fork. "I haven't decided. The will requires 6 months before I can make that choice." "What about your job? What about me?" "You'll always be my priority, Ethan. Nothing changes that. But you're not coming to my games, not helping with homework, not there when I wake up from nightmares about falling." Ethan's voice cracked. "You're hundreds of miles away protecting some dead guy's legacy. How is that making me a priority?" The words landed like physical blows. Marcus wanted to explain about the 73 refugees, about the Bergstrom family's sacrifice, about Gerald's lifetime of guardianship. But doing so meant revealing secrets he'd sworn to protect, meant involving his son in decisions that shouldn't burden a 14-year-old. "After the accident, I couldn't sleep." Marcus spoke slowly, choosing honesty over comfort. "Every time I closed my eyes, I saw you falling. Saw the moment I looked away. I blamed myself for not being more careful, for not keeping you safe. The divorce just made it worse. I felt like I'd failed at everything that mattered. So you came here to what? Punish yourself, to find purpose, to discover if I could protect something successfully after failing to protect you." Ethan stared at him. "I didn't need protecting from a hiking trail. I needed you to teach me to be more careful, to help me learn from the mistake instead of treating me like I was broken." The insight from his 14-year-old son cut deeper than Jennifer's anger or Tom's disappointment or Dr. Chin's moral arguments. Marcus had been so consumed by his own guilt that he'd failed to see what Ethan actually needed. Not a guardian who prevented all harm, but a father who helped him navigate consequences. "You're right. I'm sorry." They finished dinner in silence that felt less hostile than contemplative. Afterward, Ethan asked to see the barn. Marcus's chest tightened. "It's not safe. The structure needs work before anyone can go inside." "Then show me the outside. I want to see what has you so worried." They walked through the twilight, the barn materializing from shadows like something from a different era. Ethan circled it slowly, examining the sealed door, the reinforced boards, the modern padlock that contradicted the ancient construction. "What's really in there, Dad?" Marcus thought about lying, about maintaining the cover story. But something in his son's expression stopped him. Ethan had been through too much to be sheltered from difficult truths, had earned the right to understand what his father was protecting, something that people died to keep safe, something that your great-uncle spent 60 years guarding, something I'm not sure I'm qualified to protect, but don't know how to abandon. "Can I see it?" "No." "Why not?" "Because once you know, you become responsible too. The knowledge becomes a burden you'll carry the rest of your life." Ethan studied the barn, then turned to Marcus. "You've been carrying it alone for almost a month. Maybe sharing the burden would make it lighter." The wisdom in the words surprised Marcus. His son, who he'd been trying to protect from hard truths, was offering to help bear the weight of secrets that had consumed generations. Marcus looked at the barn, at the sealed door that waited patiently, at the choice he'd been avoiding. "Not tonight, but maybe tomorrow, before your mom picks you up, if you still want to know." They returned to the house, sat in the study while Marcus read passages from Gerald's journals aloud. Not the entries about the barn, but the observations about wildlife, about seasons changing, about the quiet satisfaction of living deliberately in places most people had forgotten. Ethan listened, asking occasional questions, and Marcus saw his son beginning to understand what had drawn Gerald to this life. What might be drawing Marcus toward the same choice? That night, Marcus lay awake in his room while Ethan slept in the adjacent bedroom. Thought about Jennifer's threat to modify custody, about Tom's deadline, about Dr. Chin's arguments regarding descendants who deserve closure. But mostly he thought about Ethan's offer to share the burden, about whether involving his son was protecting him or exposing him to responsibilities no teenager should carry. Morning brought decision. Marcus woke Ethan early, cooked breakfast, then said, "If you want to see what's in the barn, today's the day. But once I show you, you can't unknow it. Can't pretend you never saw. The knowledge becomes yours to protect or reveal. Your choice to make." Ethan nodded. "I understand." They walked to the barn in silence. Marcus opened the padlock with the key Gerald had left, removed the boards he'd reinforced after breaking the original seal. The door slid open, revealing the impossible space beyond. Ethan stepped inside, flashlight beam sweeping across carved stone, symbols, the doorway that led deeper. This isn't a barn. It was once. The Bergstrom family built it in 1918 as a facade, to hide what was underneath. Marcus led his son to the stone door, placed his hand against its surface. The warmth returned, the symbols beginning their faint glow. "Watch." The door swung open. Ethan's eyes went wide as the passage revealed itself, as stairs descended into darkness that swallowed light. "What is this?" "A memorial. A tomb. A trust that has been protected for over 100 years." They descended together, Marcus watching his son's face as they emerged into the vast chamber. Showed him the inscriptions, read the Bergstrom family's words aloud, explained how they discovered the refugees and chosen to protect them rather than expose them to the world's curiosity. Then he led Ethan to the ice, to the passage where 73 souls lay frozen in their final moments, where the Bergstrom family had joined them in death to honor their commitment in life. Ethan stood before the ice, silent, his flashlight illuminating faces preserved perfectly by cold and darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "They're real. All of them. 73 refugees who died seeking freedom in 1856. 6 Bergstroms who died protecting them in 1924. Gerald, who gave up his entire life to ensure they stayed protected. And now me. And me, Ethan said quietly. You showed me. That makes it my responsibility too. Marcus felt tears he hadn't expected. I shouldn't have involved you. I asked to be involved. I needed to understand why this matters more than your job or being close to me. Ethan turned from the ice. Do their families know? The refugees, do they have descendants who are looking for them? Yes. A historian has been researching them. She wants access to the property, wants to tell those families what happened. So why don't you let her? Because the Bergstroms believe their dignity mattered more than closure for the living. Because opening this to the world means disturbing graves that people died protecting. Ethan was quiet, processing. Then, what do you think they would want? The 73 people in the ice, if they could choose, would they want their families to know what happened, or would they want to stay hidden? The question cut to the heart of Marcus's dilemma. He'd been so focused on honoring the Bergstrom's sacrifice that he hadn't considered what the refugees themselves might have wanted. I don't know. Maybe that's what you need to figure out. Not what Gerald wanted or what the Bergstroms wanted, but what the people who actually died would choose if they had a voice. They climbed back to the surface, emerged into morning sunlight that felt harsh after the darkness. Ethan sat on the grass outside the barn, processing what he'd seen. Marcus sat beside him, waiting. I understand now why you stayed, Ethan said finally. This is important, bigger than jobs or custody arrangements or anything normal. But you can't do it alone. Gerald tried that, and it cost him his family. If you're going to be the guardian, you need to find a way to do it that doesn't mean abandoning everyone who cares about you. The wisdom from his 14-year-old son struck Marcus silent. Ethan was right. Gerald's approach had worked for Gerald, but Marcus wasn't Gerald. He had a son who needed him, a life that still had potential, a choice between isolation and connection. I don't know if that's possible. Then figure it out, because I didn't come all the way up here just to watch you disappear into the mountains like great Uncle Gerald. Ethan stood. I'm going to tell Mom you're okay, that you're dealing with something real, not running away. But you need to come back, Dad. Maybe not permanently. Maybe you split time between here and there. But you need to come back. Jennifer arrived at sunset to collect Ethan. Marcus walked his son to the car, hugged him properly this time, felt Ethan return the embrace without reservation. He seems better, Jennifer said, studying Marcus. Whatever you two talked about, it helped. He helped me more than I helped him. After they left, Marcus stood in the empty yard, feeling the isolation return. But it felt different now, less like refuge and more like exile. Ethan was right. He needed to find a balance between protecting the trust and maintaining connections to the world beyond these mountains. He called Dr. Chun. Mr. Webb. She sounded surprised. I'd given up on hearing from you. I need to ask you something. If you gained access to the property, if you found what you're looking for, what would happen? Specifically, what would happen to the remains? That depends. If they're historically significant, proper protocols would require documentation, analysis, possibly relocation to appropriate facilities. The descendants would be consulted, given options for reburial if they chose. So the bodies would be disturbed, removed from where they died. If that's where you found them, yes. But Mr. Webb, these people have families who have been searching for answers for 170 years. Doesn't that matter? It does. But so does honoring the wishes of the people who died protecting them. And if those wishes conflict with the needs of the living? Marcus didn't have an answer. After hanging up, he sat in Gerald's study, surrounded by journals that documented one man's choice to prioritize the dead over the living, and wondered if there was a third option no one had considered yet. His phone rang again. Tom Fletcher. Webb, your leave expires tomorrow. Are you coming back, or do I process your resignation? Marcus looked at the calendar. 4.5 months remaining on the will's requirement. A job that had defined him for 15 years hanging in the balance. A son who needed him present, not absent. I need more time. That's not an option. You're out of authorized leave. Either return to duty or separate from service. The deadline forced clarity. Marcus couldn't keep both lives. Couldn't be a ranger stationed hours away while fulfilling the residence requirement. Couldn't split himself between two responsibilities that demanded complete commitment. Process my resignation. Effective immediately. Silence on the other end. Then, you sure about this? No, but I'm sure I can't do both. After hanging up, Marcus felt the weight of the decision settle. He'd just given up his career, his income, his identity as a park ranger, all to protect graves of people who died before he was born. But as he sat in the darkness, listening to the house settle around him, he didn't feel regret. He felt something else. Purpose, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that some responsibilities transcended conventional measures of success. He opened a fresh journal, began writing. Day 27. Ethan visited. Showed him what's in the barn. He understood better than I expected. Asked the question I've been avoiding. What would the refugees want if they could choose? I don't have the answer yet, but I'm starting to think the answer matters more than what the Bergstroms wanted or what Gerald wanted. The dead deserve honor, but maybe that honor looks different than I assumed. Resigned from the Forest Service today. First time in 15 years, I'm not a ranger. Don't know what I am instead. Guardian? Custodian? Fool who threw away his career for people who can't even thank him? But I know this. Ethan was right. I can't do this alone. Gerald tried isolation, and it destroyed his connections to everyone he loved. I need to find a different way. A way that honors the trust while maintaining ties to the living. 4.5 months to figure it out. Starting tomorrow, I begin looking for solutions instead of just protecting secrets. He set down his pen, turned off the light, and went to bed in a house that felt less like refuge and more like the beginning of something he didn't yet understand but was committed to discovering. Outside, the barn kept its secrets, but inside Marcus's mind, the seeds of a different approach were taking root. An approach that might honor both the dead who deserve protection and the living who deserve closure. He didn't know yet what that approach looked like, but he had time. Not infinite time, not the 6 decades Gerald had spent, but enough time to find an answer that served everyone instead of forcing a choice between competing goods. 4.5 months. It would have to be enough. The answer came not from Gerald's journals or the Bergstrom's inscriptions, but from a source Marcus hadn't expected. 3 days after resigning from the Forest Service, he received a package via courier, the delivery driver having struggled up the logging road with determined persistence. Inside was a book, leather-bound and old, with a note from Dr. Chun. Mr. Webb, I respect your need to protect whatever you've found, but I'm sending this in hopes it might inform your decision. It's Greta Hansen's diary, the woman who turned back from the 1856 journey. She wrote it between 1856 and 1903, documenting her life without her sister Carrie and the others who disappeared. Read the last entry, then decide if keeping her family in perpetual grief honors the dead or betrays them. Dr. Sarah Chun. Marcus opened a diary to the final pages, found an entry dated March 15, 1903, written in shaky handwriting that reflected age and illness. I am dying. The doctor says perhaps a week, perhaps less. And I die without knowing what became of Carrie, of my parents, of the 72 souls who walked into those mountains and never emerged. For 47 years, I have searched, written letters to every settlement, every trading post, every authority who might have records. Found nothing. No graves, no survivors, no evidence they existed beyond the space they occupied in my memory. My children think I'm obsessed. My grandchildren humor an old woman who cannot let go. But they don't understand. Carrie was 16 when she left. Bright, hopeful, certain that the new land would offer opportunities Norway couldn't. She hugged me goodbye, told me to hurry and join them once the baby was born. Promised to write the moment they reached their destination. I never received that letter. Never heard her voice again. Never learned if she suffered or if the end was quick. Never knew if she thought of me in those final moments, if she died feeling abandoned by the sister who should have protected her. This is my torment, not knowing, not being able to mourn properly, because mourning requires certainty, and I have lived in perpetual uncertainty for nearly half a century. If anyone ever finds them, if their bones lie somewhere in those mountains, I beg whoever discovers them to tell their families, to release us from this purgatory of not knowing. The dead deserve peace, but so do the living who love them. I die hoping, though I know hope is foolish now. Carrie is gone. They're all gone. But somewhere in the earth they wait. And I pray that someday someone will find them and will understand that silence is its own cruelty. Forgive me, Carrie, for not being there, for surviving when you did not, for failing to find you despite spending my life searching. I go to my grave with this failure, praying that God will reunite us in death since fate separated us in life. Marcus set down the diary, hands shaking. Greta Hansen had died without knowing what he now knew, had spent 47 years in the torment of uncertainty, had carried that grief to her grave, had begged in her final words for exactly what Marcus was refusing to provide. He walked to the barn, stood before the sealed door, and for the first time questioned whether the Bergstroms had made the right choice. They protected the refugees' dignity, yes, but they'd also condemned families like Greta Hansen's to perpetual grief, to questions that could never be answered, to graves they could never visit. Was that honor? Or was it a different kind of cruelty, well-intentioned but devastating nonetheless? Marcus returned to the house, pulled out his satellite phone, and made a call he'd been avoiding. Morrison, I need legal advice. If I wanted to create a memorial on this property, something that honored the dead while providing closure to their families, what would that look like? The lawyer was quiet for a moment. Are you saying you found human remains? I'm saying hypothetically, if there were remains on the property that had historical significance, how would I proceed? Depend on the circumstances. If they're Native American, NAGPRA laws apply. If they're more recent, state laws regarding burial sites. But generally, you need to notify authorities, conduct, proper documentation, consult with relevant communities. He paused. Marcus, what exactly did you find in that barn? Something that requires a better solution than the one Gerald chose. I'll call you back. Marcus spent the next week researching, using the satellite internet connection he'd finally set up for necessity. He studied laws regarding historic burial sites, preservation requirements, family rights to remains, learned about memorials that honored the dead without disturbing them, about virtual documentation that could provide closure without excavation, and slowly a plan formed. Not Gerald's plan of complete secrecy, not Dr. Chen's plan of full excavation, but something in between. Something that might satisfy both the Bergstrom's desire to protect and Greta Hansen's need for closure. He called Dr. Chen. I'm willing to discuss limited access to the property, but under strict conditions. I'm listening. The remains stay where they are. No excavation, no removal, no physical disturbance of any kind. But I'll allow documentation, photographs through the ice, ground-penetrating radar to confirm numbers, expert analysis to identify individuals if possible. You can tell the families what happened, show them images, provide certainty. But the dead stay in the mountain. Dr. Chun was silent for a long moment. That's not standard protocol. This isn't a standard situation. The people who've been protecting this site for over 100 years had good reasons. I'm trying to honor those reasons while acknowledging that families deserve answers. I'll need to consult with colleagues, with the descendant communities. This kind of arrangement would be unprecedented. So was the Bergstrom's sacrifice. We're creating new precedent. The question is whether it serves everyone involved or just academic interests. After hanging up, Marcus felt the weight shift slightly. Not lifted, but redistributed. He wasn't carrying the decision alone anymore. He'd involved others, started a conversation that might lead to solutions he couldn't envision by himself. 2 weeks later, Dr. Chun arrived with a small team. Not the large excavation crew Marcus had feared, but 3 people. Herself, a forensic anthropologist named Dr. James Martinez, and a Norwegian genealogist named Solveig Anderson who represented the descendant families. Marcus met them at the property line, established ground rules before allowing them closer. What you see doesn't leave this property without my explicit permission. No publication, no public disclosure until we've agreed on how to proceed. This is consultation, not investigation. They agreed, signed documentation Morrison had drafted, and followed Marcus to the barn. Dr. Martinez examined the structure with professional interest. This facade is remarkable. Completely disguises what's underneath. That was the point. Inside, When Marcus opened the stone door and led them down the stairs, their reactions ranged from awe to tears. Solveig Anderson stood before the ice, hand pressed against its surface, crying silently. They're here. After 170 years, they're finally found. Dr. Chun documented everything with careful precision. Photographs that showed faces through the ice, clothing that indicated the era, positions that suggested they'd been walking when the avalanche hit. Dr. Martinez used non-invasive scanning equipment, confirmed what the Bergstroms had written. 73 individuals, men, women, children, frozen in a moment that had stretched across centuries. This is the most well-preserved historical discovery I've encountered, Dr. Martinez said quietly. The ice has protected them perfectly. If we remove them for study, we're not removing them. Marcus's voice was firm. That's the non-negotiable condition. But the scientific value is secondary to honoring the trust that's protected them for a century. You can document, analyze through the ice, use any non-invasive technology available. But they stay here. Solveig turned from the ice. What about families who want to visit, who want to see their ancestors? That's something we need to discuss. How to create access without compromising the site. They spent 3 days in careful documentation. Dr. Chun photographed every inscription, every detail. Dr. Martinez conducted thorough scans, building a comprehensive record of the site without disturbing it. Solveig worked on identifying individuals through clothing, positions, comparing historical records to what was visible through the ice. On the third evening, they gathered in the main house. Marcus had cooked dinner, venison stew that had become his specialty, and they sat around the table discussing options. I've been consulting with descendant families, Solveig said. Most are grateful just to know what happened. 170 years of uncertainty, finally answered. But some want more. Want to visit the site, want traditional burials in family plots. The Bergstroms died to prevent that, Marcus said. They believe these people deserve to rest where they fell, not be excavated and moved. The Bergstroms made that choice, Dr. Chun countered gently. But they're not here now. You are. And you get to decide whether their reasoning still applies or if circumstances have changed enough to warrant reconsideration. Marcus thought about Greta Hansen's diary, about dying without knowing, about Ethan's question, what would the refugees want if they could choose? I think we need to ask a different question. Not what we want or what the Bergstroms wanted, but what the refugees would want if we could ask them. How do we answer that? Dr. Martinez gestured helplessly. They've been dead for 170 years. We look at what we know about them. Why they were fleeing Norway, what they hoped to find, what mattered to them enough to risk that journey. Solveig pulled out her research. Most were escaping religious persecution. The Norwegian state church was oppressive in the 1850s. These people were dissenters, seeking freedom to worship as they chose. They were going to join established Norwegian communities in the interior, places where religious tolerance was greater. So freedom mattered to them, Marcus said. Freedom of belief, freedom of choice. Yes, then maybe we honor that by giving their families freedom to choose. Create a memorial here, protected and preserved. Families can visit, can mourn, can connect with their ancestors. But the remains stay. We document everything, create virtual access for those who can't make the journey. We tell their story in a way that honors both their sacrifice and their descendants' grief. Dr. Chun leaned forward. You're talking about creating a heritage site, similar to what's been done with other historical tragedies. I'm talking about finding middle ground. Gerald sealed everything to protect the dead. You wanted to excavate everything to serve the living. Neither extreme serves everyone, but a protected memorial, properly managed, might accomplish both. The conversation continued late into the night, working through logistics, legal requirements, funding sources. By dawn, they had the outline of a plan that felt right, if not perfect. Marcus would establish a nonprofit foundation to manage the site. The property would be donated to the foundation with strict preservation requirements. A small visitor center would be built near the barn, allowing families to learn the story before viewing the memorial. Access to the ice chamber would be limited, respectful, guided only. Dr. Chun would work with academic institutions to create comprehensive documentation available to researchers. Solveig would coordinate with descendant families, ensuring their needs were heard and honored. Dr. Martinez would oversee preservation efforts, making sure the site remained stable. And Marcus would remain as the guardian, the permanent keeper of a trust that had evolved but not abandoned its core purpose. This will take years to implement, Dr. Chun warned. Funding alone will be challenging. Gerald spent 60 years protecting in secret. I can spend however long it takes to protect while serving. After they left, Marcus sat in the study reading Gerald's journals with new understanding. His uncle had made the choice that seemed right in 1962, in the context of his time, his understanding, his limitations. But times changed. Understanding evolved. And responsibilities could be honored in different ways while maintaining their essential purpose. He began writing letters to descendant families, using addresses Solveig provided. Each letter was personal, acknowledging their loss, describing what had been found, explaining the plan to create a memorial that honored both the dead and the living. The responses came slowly. Some families were grateful, relieved to finally have answers. Some were angry, demanding full burial rites. Some were conflicted, torn between wanting to bring their ancestors home and respecting the sanctity of the site. Marcus answered every letter personally, explained the Bergstrom sacrifice, the reasons for preservation, the compromise being offered, listened to concerns, adapted the plan where possible, held firm on non-negotiables. 3 months into the process, a letter arrived from Ingrid Larsen, the 83-year-old Norwegian woman whose profile Marcus had found online. Dear Mr. Webb, I'm the great-great-granddaughter of Greta Hansen, who lost her sister Carrie in the 1856 disappearance. I have spent my entire life continuing Greta's search, trying to fulfill the promise she made to find out what happened. Your letter answering that question has given me peace I never expected to feel, knowing that Carrie didn't suffer, that the end was quick, that she rests in the mountains with her family. This is closure I thought impossible. Greta died believing she had failed her sister. But she didn't fail. She just didn't live long enough for the answer to emerge. I wish I could tell her that Carrie has been protected, honored, remembered by people who never knew her but understood her worth. I am too old to travel to America, to visit the memorial you're creating. But knowing it exists, knowing someone cares enough to protect my family's memory, this is gift beyond measure. Thank you for choosing a harder path, for finding a way to serve both the dead who deserve peace and the living who deserve closure. This is what Greta would have wanted, I think. Not excavation or disturbance, but acknowledgement, recognition that these lives mattered. You carry a heavy burden, Mr. Webb, but you carry it with honor. The Bergstroms will be proud, I think. And Greta, if she knows, will be grateful. May God bless your work. Ingrid Larsen. Marcus read the letter 3 times, then carefully filed it with the others. Evidence that the path he'd chosen was right, even when it was difficult. Ethan called that evening, their weekly check-in that had become something more. Real conversation, not supervised obligation. How's the memorial planning going? Complicated. Good, but complicated. We're working with 5 different descendant groups, 3 government agencies, and academic institutions across 2 countries. Sounds overwhelming. It is, but it's also the most important work I've ever done. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I told my therapist about what you showed me, about the people and the ice, about why you stayed. Marcus's chest tightened. You weren't supposed to tell anyone. She's bound by confidentiality, and she needed to understand why I wasn't upset about you being gone anymore, why I was actually proud of what you're doing. The words hit harder than Marcus expected. You're proud. Yeah, you could have taken the easy path, sold the property, walked away, let someone else deal with it. But you didn't. You chose the hard thing because it was the right thing. That's what you always taught me about wilderness ethics. Leave things better than you found them. After hanging up, Marcus sat in the darkness, feeling something shift. Not the weight lifting, but his relationship to it changing. The burden felt less like punishment and more like privilege. The isolation felt less like exile and more like sacred trust. He wasn't Gerald, hiding from the world to protect secrets. He was building something that would outlast him, creating a legacy that served rather than isolated. The foundation paperwork took 4 months to finalize. Marcus worked with Morrison to establish legal structures that would protect the site in perpetuity. The property was transferred to the foundation with covenants that prevented development, required preservation, ensured family access while maintaining sanctity. Funding came from unexpected sources. Descendant families contributed. Norwegian government allocated grants for cultural heritage preservation. Academic institutions provided research support. A wealthy donor, moved by the story, established an endowment that would support operations indefinitely. And through it all, Marcus lived on the property, maintaining the buildings, protecting the site, beginning the transformation from homestead to memorial. Jennifer called 6 months after his resignation, her tone different than before. Less angry, more curious. Ethan's therapist says he's made remarkable progress. She credits you, the work you're doing up there. He credits himself. He did the hard work of processing. He also says you've been involving him in the memorial planning, asking his opinion on design decisions. He has good instincts, and this is going to be part of his inheritance someday. He should help shape it. A long pause. I owe you an apology. I thought you were running away, that you'd abandoned us for some selfish reason. But Ethan explained what you're protecting, why it matters. I still don't fully understand, but I respect it. That's all I can ask. He wants to visit again. Spend a week helping with construction once the visitor center starts. I'm okay with that if you are. Marcus looked around the property, at the progress made, at the work still ahead. I'd like that. The visitor center broke ground in early spring, 1 year after Marcus had first opened the barn door. A simple structure, designed to blend with the landscape, built using sustainable materials and historical construction methods that honored the Bergstrom's craftsmanship. Ethan came for 2 weeks, worked alongside construction crews, learned skills Marcus had acquired over the past year. Together, they built display cases that would hold artifacts, installed lighting that would illuminate without harming, created spaces that balanced education with reverence. This is going to be amazing when it's finished, Ethan said one evening, both of them exhausted for physical labor. People are going to come from all over the world. That's the hope. But it's not about tourism. It's about making sure those 73 people, and the Bergstroms, and Gerald, that all of them are remembered for what they sacrificed. Do you think the refugees know? Somehow, do you think they understand that people are still protecting them? Marcus thought about the question seriously. I don't know if the dead know anything, but I think the act of protection matters regardless. It says something about us, about what we value, about whether we believe dignity ends with death. The memorial opened to families first, a private ceremony 18 months after Marcus had inherited the property. Representatives from 5 descendant groups came, some elderly, some young, all carrying the weight of generations seeking answers. Solveig Anderson led the ceremony, speaking in Norwegian and English. She told the story of the 1856 journey, of the refugees seeking freedom, of the avalanche that had stolen their futures but not their dignity. She honored the Bergstroms, who had sacrificed everything to protect strangers. She thanked Gerald for his 60 years of guardianship, and she thanked Marcus for finding a way forward that honored both past and present. For 170 years, our families have lived with absence, with empty chairs at tables, with stories that ended mid-sentence, with grief that couldn't resolve because we lacked certainty. Today, that changes. Today, we know what happened. We know our ancestors died quickly, together, pursuing freedom that mattered more to them than safety. We know they've been protected, honored, remembered by people who understood that some responsibilities transcend personal connection. This memorial stands as testament to what humans can be at their best: protective of the vulnerable, honoring of the dead, willing to sacrifice comfort for principle. May those who visit here learn not just history, but humanity. The families entered the chamber in small groups, Marcus guiding each one. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stood in silence, finally able to mourn properly after generations of uncertainty. An elderly man named Eric Johansson, descended from one of the refugees, stood before the ice for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. My great-great-grandfather was 8 years old. His name was Ol. He wanted to be a farmer, like his father. Instead, he became ice in memory. He turned to Marcus. Thank you for making sure memory won. After the families left, Dr. Chun approached Marcus. You did something remarkable here. Created a model for how to handle sensitive historical discoveries with respect and inclusion. I had good teachers. The Bergstrom showed what sacrifice looks like. Gerald showed what dedication means. Ethan showed that sharing burdens makes them lighter. What about you? What did you learn? Marcus looked at the barn, at the memorial that had consumed 2 years of his life, at the purpose he'd found in protecting something bigger than himself. I learned that inheritance isn't about what you receive. It's about what you do with what you're given. Gerald gave me a secret. I turned it into a legacy. That transformation, that's the real inheritance. The memorial opened to the public 6 months later. Visitor numbers were deliberately limited, access carefully controlled. No more than 20 people per day. Reservations required months in advance. Strict protocols for behavior in the chamber. Marcus hired staff to help manage operations. Former rangers who understood wilderness ethics. Historians who could tell the story accurately. Local community members who needed employment. The foundation thrived. Academic research continued under strict guidelines. Descendant families visited regularly. Educational programs taught about sacrifice, about migration, about the complicated ethics of protection versus exposure. And Marcus lived on the property, no longer isolated but integrated. He maintained relationships with Ethan, saw his son regularly when he visited to help with maintenance, developed friendships with staff and visitors, found community in the shared purpose of preservation. 2 years after opening, Marcus received a call from Tom Fletcher, his former supervisor. I heard about what you built up there. The memorial, the foundation. Impressive work. Thanks. It's been challenging. We're looking for someone to manage a new program, partnership between the Forest Service and historic preservation sites. Liaison work, helping other locations develop sustainable tourism while protecting resources. The job's based regionally, lots of travel, good pay. Thought of you immediately. Marcus considered the offer. A return to the Forest Service, but in a different capacity. Work that built on everything he'd learned. A chance to apply the lessons of the memorial to other sites. Would the position allow me to keep living here? To continue managing the foundation? That's the idea. We need someone who understands both conservation and community engagement. You've proven you could do both. After hanging up, Marcus walked to the barn, stood before what was no longer a sealed door, but an entrance to a memorial that served thousands. He thought about Gerald, who'd sealed it out of fear that exposure would mean exploitation. About the Bergstroms, who'd died believing secrecy was the only protection. They'd been right for their time. But times changed, and Marcus had found a way to honor their sacrifice while evolving beyond their methods. He accepted the job, began work that took him across the region, helping other sites develop preservation strategies that balance protection with access, shared the lessons learned from the memorial, the importance of involving communities, the value of finding middle ground between absolute secrecy and complete exposure. Ethan graduated high school, chose to study environmental science and cultural preservation, spent summers working at the memorial, learning from his father the skills of guardianship that had been passed down through generations. One evening, 3 years after the memorial opened, Marcus and Ethan sat on the porch of the main house. The visitor center was closed for the day, the property quiet except for wind through the pines and the distant call of an owl. I've been thinking about college essays, Ethan said, about what to write, and I keep coming back to that first visit when you showed me what was in the barn. What about it? You gave me a choice. To see or not see, to know or stay ignorant. Most parents try to protect their kids from hard truths, but you trusted me to handle it. You were ready, and you proved me right. I want to write about inheritance, about how what we inherit isn't just property or money, but responsibility. Purpose, the obligation to protect things that matter, even when it's difficult. Marcus felt pride swell in his chest. That's a good theme. You taught me that. By staying here, by choosing the hard path, by finding a way to honor the dead while serving the living. You show me what it means to be a guardian of something bigger than yourself. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered. The barn stood silent in the twilight, no longer a prison for secrets, but a gateway to understanding. The 73 refugees rested peacefully, their story known, their dignity preserved, their sacrifice memorialized. Marcus thought about the journey from that first day, standing in the barn staring at a sealed door, to this moment of completion and continuation. Thought about the choices made, the burdens carried, the transformations achieved. He'd inherited a secret and turned it into a legacy. Had honored the dead while serving the living. Had found purpose in protection and meaning in service. The memorial would outlast him, would continue its work long after he was gone. Other guardians would come, trained by him or by those he trained. The foundation would evolve, adapt to changing times while maintaining core principles. But the essential truth remained constant. Some things were worth protecting, even at great personal cost. Some responsibilities transcended individual lives, and some inheritances demanded not acceptance, but transformation. Marcus stood, stretched, and looked at his son. Want to check the barn before we turn in? Always. They walked together through the gathering dark, two guardians of a trust that had been passed down across a century, evolved through sacrifice and dedication, and the willingness to find new solutions to old problems. The barn door opened smoothly, well-maintained and frequently used. They descended the stairs, not with flashlights now, but with permanent lighting that had been carefully installed to preserve while illuminating. The chamber was exactly as Marcus had first seen it, except for the additions that made it accessible. Walkways that protected the floor inscriptions. Viewing platforms that allowed safe observation of the ice. Information panels that told the story in multiple languages. But the ice remained untouched. The refugees rested undisturbed. The Bergstroms lay with those they died protecting. And Gerald's legacy lived on through careful stewardship rather than isolated secrecy. Do you ever regret it? Ethan asked, giving up your ranger career, spending years on this instead of rebuilding your life. Marcus looked at the ice, at the faces preserved by cold and dedication. Every day I'm grateful I made the choice I did. This isn't what I expected to inherit, but it's what I needed. Purpose, meaning, the chance to protect something that matters. And now I get to watch it continue. Get to train the next guardians. Get to see the memorials serve families who need closure and educate people about sacrifice and preservation. That's better than any career I gave up. They stood in silence, honoring the dead with their presence, continuing the vigil that had begun over a century ago. Then they climbed back to the surface, secured the door, and walked to the house through a night brilliant with stars. In the study, Marcus opened the journal he'd been keeping, added an entry. 3 years since I first opened the door, Gerald sealed. 3 years of transformation, challenge, growth. The memorial thrives. Families find closure. The dead rest in honor. And I've learned that guardianship doesn't mean isolation. It means community, shared purpose, evolution while maintaining core values. Ethan wants to continue this work after college. Wants to become the next guardian when I can no longer serve. The inheritance continues, passed to someone who understands not just what we protect, but why protection matters. Gerald spent 60 years alone, believing secrecy was the only option. The Bergstroms died believing the same. But they were wrong about method, even if right about purpose. Secrets can be shared. Burdens can be distributed. Protection can include rather than exclude. This is what I'll pass to the next generation. Not just a memorial, but a model for how to honor the past while serving the present. How to find balance between competing goods. How to make hard choices with wisdom rather than fear. The 73 refugees rest peacefully. The Bergstroms' sacrifice is honored. Gerald's dedication continues. And I've found purpose I never expected in a barn I almost didn't open. Some inheritances demand everything, but they give back more than they take if we're willing to see beyond immediate costs to lasting value. He set down his pen, turned off the light, and went to bed in a house that had become home. Outside, the memorial kept its vigil. Inside, a guardian rested, knowing the work would continue tomorrow and all the tomorrows after. Marcus Webb had inherited more than property. He'd inherited responsibility, purpose, and the opportunity to transform isolation into community, secrecy into legacy, burden into blessing. And in the morning, he'd wake and continue the work. Not because he had to, but because he'd chosen to, because some things were worth protecting, some sacrifices were worth honoring, and some doors, once opened, revealed not endings but beginnings. The barn stood in the darkness, no longer sealed against the world, but open to those who could understand its significance. And within it, 73 souls rested in the eyes, finally known, finally honored, finally able to give their families the closure that had been denied for 170 years. This was the inheritance. This was the legacy. This was what it meant to be a guardian not of secrets, but of truth preserved with dignity, shared with wisdom, and protected with love that transcended time and death and the boundaries between the living and those who had gone before. Marcus slept peacefully, knowing he had honored the trust. And tomorrow, the work would continue. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.